Today we will be talking about digital commons and the tragedy of online commodification. It will make more sense when we get through like the three parts of the presentation. But the reason why I decided that this is an important topic is because Activist Handbook is an online resource that is peer-to-peer, and it's created by activists for activists. And when it comes to copyrights and what is protected as what knowledge is gate kept, and what knowledge is available freely to everyone, this is an interesting topic to go through. So we will first be talking about online and offline commons. What are those? What's the main difference between them? Then we'll be talking about fencing off on the internet. Like the fencing off happened first in the commons in the 19th century, which caused capitalism. Then when internet came as an online space that is free for everyone, it had to be fenced off the same way that the natural commons were, in a similar way, actually, not the same way. And then we'll talk about a little bit about copyright and copyleft, and what are copyrights and what are they for, and what can we do about them. So without further ado, let's see. First, what are commons? Commons are resources or goods that are basically available in the nature or in the digital space when it comes to digital commons, and they're not. We cannot easily exclude people from use of these resources. So, for example, when it comes to material commons, those are pastures or fisheries, forests, and so on. Parts of nature that people like, that people use for usufruct, so to speak. They enjoy the fruits of nature without necessarily having to do anything to create them. In a similar way, digital commons are created by humans, but they are freely available for everyone else who wants to use them, modify them, and apply them in various ways, develop them, and so on and so forth. Commons can be divided in many different, like we can separate them in many different ways, but this typology of material and digital commons in this sense is important because of the story of the tragedy of the commons, which was promoted by Garrett Hardin in the 68. And it's the story, you probably already heard it before, about how there's this green pasture, and then two herdsmen decide to take their cows to eat on this pasture. And since the pasture doesn't belong to anyone, they do not take care of it, and in time, with the growth of the number of cows in the herds and so on, there's nothing left of the pasture. There's only a barren land. And this is of course a story. It's not a thing that actually happened, but it was used in the 60s, at the end of the 60s, to promote neoliberalism and to promote privatization, to explain how when things are in private property, then people take care of them because they belong to them and so on and so forth. But then they're in public property or they don't belong to anybody, then they get destroyed. But something that is implied in this story are the natural existences of competition markets and rationality, which is selfish. Nowhere in the story did the two herdsmen ever talk to each other like, hey, let's work together. Let's bring our cows in the same herd, and that way we'll have more time. We'll decide what we want to do with the rest of our free time and so on. So the competition is there from the start. There's no talk about possible cooperation, which is something that they could have done equally well. Then the second thing, if they kept on increasing the number of cows in their herds, they must have thought about what to do with the excess of milk and meat that they were having, because there's only so much you can eat and drink in your lifetime. The rest has to go somewhere, and where does it go? It obviously goes to the market, where it is exchanged for other goods and services that you need. So markets are also implied in this story. And the rationality, which is selfish, where these men decided to only think about their personal interest and their personal gain without thinking about the consequences to the pasture, the consequences to other people who might use the pasture, or potential other herders, and so on. But we all know that we are not just selfish people, that there's also selflessness, and that there is cooperation that comes naturally to us, especially if we think about our family and friends and these kinds of personal relationships. And the tragedy of the commons is very difficult to apply to digital goods, because unlike real goods, which are limited, well, like there's only so much fish you can fish from a pond before it gets because before there's no more fish in there, digital goods can be multiplied practically indefinitely, and they're not rival. That means that if you have a book in a PDF form, or a video game, or a piece of music, you can freely distribute it to as many people as you want. And someone reading a PDF book does not mean, like in the case of library, that the same book is not going to be available for someone else in physical form. So what happened, and how did we end up having an online space which looks more and more like these real fenced off spaces where you have to pay subscription fees to Netflix, where you have YouTube Premium, where most of the digital content that exists on the internet is basically on servers of some private companies in the hands of transnational companies and so on. Well, I didn't say this in the beginning, but I'm not the biggest expert on this topic. There are some resources at the end that I strongly suggest you read, because I might have taken something out of context. And also, if someone knows that I said something wrong, please interrupt me and correct me if you see that I'm not making sense. So this is going to be a very simplified timeline of what happened to the internet and how it went from being a common free space to being something that we get subscriptions for. First of all, when it got created, it was publicly funded. So it was the military and the researchers working for publicly funded institutes that created the infrastructure that was later going to become internet. And in the dial-up internet that we had at first went directly to the phone lines. So it used public infrastructure that was that was owned by the states. And anybody who had a phone line could just easily get access to internet. And the providers of internet services were local, and there were many of them. And usually they were within cities and locally governed. But of course, capitalism and big corporations try to find a way to monetize this, and to try to find a way to earn money off of internet, which was in the beginning, as I said, a pretty free space where people could, which was not regulated in the beginning by the laws, and there was pretty much an anarchy, so to speak, with people who used internet. And then there was this dot-com boom, which ended in a dot-com crash, where lots of investors threw money left and right, trying to find ways to make internet a commodity, which happened by consolidation of internet providers, which means that now there are barely any small providers, local providers of internet. Most of them are owned by huge corporations such as T-Mobile in Germany, or I don't know, I'm not very, like Telenor, that is Norwegian, but now exists in Serbia, for example. Lots of transnational companies are now internet providers. And yeah, something that I also didn't message is that World Wide Web, or WWW, that we use used to be just one small part of the internet. I mean, it still is, but everything is now inside the web. While before, the web was just one of many different, one of many different widely spread practices widely spread back then. Of course, less users than now, but still, www that just works through search engines, and you need internet browsers that also belong to private companies like Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, or I don't know, Opera. One of the great examples that is still kind of free is Mozilla. Or Apple Safari. Like they're all big corporation apps and programs that we now use to access the internet. So that was the first time where exclusive cyberspaces were created, places where you had to have a subscription, that you had to, there were first services where you had to have their own infrastructure or their own devices in order to access the internet and so on. And then Web 2.0 is something that I am afraid I don't understand fully, but it is basically, it doesn't exist really. It's not actually Web 2.0. It's still the same web. It just got very well developed. where companies have exclusive control over services when online commerce started happening. So before, you could browse, for example, a website of Amazon to see what books were available there, but you could not press a button and insert your card number and buy books directly like that. You had to still physically go to the bookshop and buy your products. Now with online commerce, everything moved to the internet, and there's lots of applications. For example, in some countries, the only way to access internet is through Facebook or Google. They don't even have options to access internet in a different way. So that's how internet gradually went from being a neutral, free-for-all space into becoming like a privatized, in the hands of private multinational corporations, service that we have to subscribe to and pay a lot of money to be a part of, and where we also have to deal with all kinds of censorships and content being removed or flagged or so on and so forth. And now I'm just going to talk a bit about the property rights and how this was all justified and whether it is actually justifiable. The first idea of copyrights was actually in the 16th and 17th century. Welcome. That was used by royal, like by the sovereigns, to give licenses to publishers, so that they would control what gets published, what kind of knowledge is censored, and what kind of knowledge isn't censored. It's only from the 18th century that the copyrights become this idea of authors owning their own work, and the copyrights protecting authors from being exploited and their work being copied illegally, and so on. And of course, it comes with a capitalist logic. But even today, with all these publication companies, it's not the creators who get most of the money from the sales. It's the publishing companies that profit most from this, and they have the biggest interest in maintaining copyrights. In order to fight this on the internet, there are some groups of people who organize, for example, Free Software Foundation, which has this GLP. It's called General Public License. It is a special kind of copyright license, also known as copyleft, which uses the copyright law in order to protect consumers. So everything that is produced in the GPL has this caveat that it has to be freely shared and modified by anybody, and that it cannot be used for commercial services, for commercial uses. And for example, Apache and GNU Linux are used by Android, by Google, sorry, by Amazon, by Facebook, but these are all public domain. Are those programming languages, or are they? Maybe Joppe can help me with this one.
Well, I mean, it differs, but I mean, they're all pieces of software published under open source licenses.
Yes, so they are actually, whether it's open source or if it's free software, there's a slight difference, because open source can still be fall under the copyright laws and be gate kept, unlike free software. And yeah, now I'm realizing that I've been speaking too much, but there's still a couple of things to say. The issue, this is a great idea, and ideologically it's perfect that people just come together to work on creating something that is free for everybody. But in a world where the capitalist world is still material, and these companies can freely use these creations that are for everybody in order to make money and to earn profit, there are some other kinds of licenses that started popping up, such as peer production license, which only allows certain kinds of organizations to use products protected by these licenses. For example, cooperatives, everything that is mutually owned, not privately owned. And there is really a lot to read about, and it's very legal when it comes to these licenses. It's not something that I'm very good at, but philosophically, it's a really interesting thing to think about. The the ways in which we can cooperate and work together, but not self-exploit and allow people who exist in capitalist systems to profit from our free labor. Yeah, I think, yeah, these are some resources. When you click on these, we have to share the, yeah, I'm gonna copy a link and send it to the chat, so then you can click on the links if you want to read these. The Telecommunist Manifesto is an 80-page history of copyleft, copyright, and it's very easy to understand, and it gives a much more detailed timeline from the oversimplified one I gave earlier. And policy proposals for open knowledge, common society is much broader and a bigger document, and yeah, it is more related to outside of the internet. It's commons in general, not just digital commons. And the final one is in Serbian, but hopefully with Google translation and algorithms, you can read these articles in your own language by clicking translate. It's a really good article, the one that I started from when creating this presentation.